Hello, Anime VISOR here,
and SiGNUM,
with a retro anime review, a series in which I take a look at an older anime, share some history on it, as well as any influences it may have had on later anime or anime culture, and then I'll close with my personal thoughts, i.e. review, of the anime to see if it's worth the watch or not. For this particular retro anime review, I'll be taking a look at Lupin III Part 1. Before getting too far into the video, my personal experience with Lupin III has mostly been with the newer films and TV anime. My first foray into the Lupin III series started with The Woman Called Fujiko Mine. After watching it, I checked out some of the more recent movies and specials at the time, and have been more or less hooked on and keeping up with the series since. While I enjoy a lot of the modern Lupin III series, I've been keen on wanting to go back and watch earlier entries of the series. I've done that with a handful of the older Lupin III movies, but was finally able to find some time to watch and experience where the Lupin III anime began. Lupin III Part 1.
Wasn't there a pilot episode that came out before that?
There was. A Lupin III pilot episode came out in 1969. It's about 15 minutes long and was made to test the waters with audiences to see if a Lupin III anime was viable. It seems that there was enough interest as around 2 years later, in 1971, Lupin III Part 1, at the time simply titled Lupin III, would hit the airwaves in Japan. Based on a manga from 1967 by Kazuhiko Kato, more commonly known by his pen name Monkey Punch, who passed away in 2019, Lupin III follows the thieving exploits of the grandson of the gentleman thief Arsène Lupin. Alongside Lupin III is his right-hand man and expert sharpshooter, Daisuke Jigen, his on and off love interest and femme fatale, Fujiko Mine, and expert samurai swordsman Goemon Ishikawa the 13th, all of which are ruthlessly pursued by Inspector Zenigata. With the main characters introduced, I should probably mention and clarify that a huge inspiration for Lupin III was from a series of novels by Maurice Leblanc that started in 1905, featured the gentleman thief Arsène Lupin.
That's a really long time ago.
It is. So I don't blame anyone for not knowing that Lupin III's grandfather is a character from a series of French crime novels from over 100 years ago. I had assumed for a while people were familiar with or at least had heard of the original Arsène Lupin, but after seeing some of the comments on the trailer for the new Lupin series coming to Netflix, there were seemingly quite a few people who were only familiar with the Lupin III anime. In fact, what is probably Lupin III's most well-known film, Castle of Cagliostro, was inspired by an Arsène Lupin novel from 1924 called La Comtesse de Cagliostro, or Countess of Cagliostro. But it's not just Lupin III who has a direct ancestor that comes from a separate fictional story. It's implied that Inspector Zenigata is a descendant of Zenigata Heiji, who was a detective in a series of Japanese crime novels that began in 1931. On top of that, Goemon Ishikawa the 13th is a 13th generation descendant of Ishikawa Goemon, who in fact is a real-world historical figure. History paints him as an outlaw hero that stole from the rich and gave to the poor, like a Japanese Robin Hood, but ultimately would later be boiled alive along with his son for his failed assassination attempt of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And if you know a little Japanese history, Toyotomi Hideyoshi was a pretty big deal. In case you're wondering about the inspiration for Jigen and Fujiko, according to Monkey Punch, Jigen was inspired by actor James Coburn, especially his role as Britt from the movie The Magnificent Seven, itself a Wild West remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Regarding Fujiko Mine, she came about because Monkey Punch wanted to add a female presence to the series, with the intention of having a Bond girl-like role, similar to what you see in James Bond films. And initially, each new chapter of the original manga featured a new woman. A bit by happenstance, many of the women were named Fujiko, but were all treated as separate characters. Eventually, making a new character a week was too difficult for Monkey Punch. The concept was then changed to having a single character named Fujiko, who changes style and appearance frequently. I brought up all this stuff about the characters, not to say that it's bad or unoriginal, I just think it's interesting to know what inspired and led to the creation of a series and of characters that I like, and that maybe you feel the same.
That's pretty interesting.
Thanks. Though I have spent most of my time so far describing what influenced Lupin III, so let's shift gears and discuss what Lupin III has influenced. While Lupin III Part 1 would only have 23 episodes, and was cancelled due to poor ratings at the time, the series continues to this day and has many movies, anime series, and TV specials. While not every single entry in the series has been something to write home about, the longevity of the series is impressive, and I don't think it's a stretch to assume Lupin III is a cultural icon in Japan, much like Detective Conan or Doraemon. They are some of the most well-known anime characters in Japan, but outside Japan, they don't have the same amount of recognition, mostly because not a lot of people outside Japan grew up watching them. However, with anime becoming more mainstream in the West, and Doraemon airing on Disney XD a few years ago, and Lupin III getting a full 3D animated film released in the US, things like that will hopefully encourage new fans to check out those respective series. Specifically focusing on what Lupin III Part 1 did, it gave a certain up-and-comer in the animation industry a shot at the director's chair, one Hayao Miyazaki.
Quite the name drop.
Lupin III Part 1 began under the direction of Masaaki Osumi. He would direct the first 7 episodes, as well as episodes 9 and 12, before being replaced by Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, with the two of them co-directing the other 14 episodes, 8, 10, and 11, and then episodes 13 through 23. Under Osumi, the character Lupin was portrayed as morally ambiguous and was more faithful to the manga's darker tone. However, ratings weren't very good, and per request by Yasuo Otsuka, who was the animation director for Lupin III Part 1 and had worked with the two before at Toei, Miyazaki and Takahata came in to direct. Otsuka, Miyazaki, and Takahata all agreed a change was needed. With Miyazaki and Takahata at the helm, Lupin would be more happy-go-lucky and upbeat, with the anime taking a lighter, more family-friendly tone, which would be the blueprint for many later Lupin III series. If you're familiar with anime history, you'll know that Miyazaki and Takahata would later go on to co-found Studio Ghibli, which surely needs no introduction. Castle in the Sky, Rave of the Fireflies, Spirited Away, just to name a few. Many critically acclaimed anime films have come out of Studio Ghibli, with either Miyazaki or Takahata being the director of said films. While the two had worked together previously, and Takahata had directed before, Lupin III was Miyazaki's first crack at directing an anime, and I think it's fair to say, things worked out pretty well in the long run in terms of the quality of anime films he would later release. Not only has the Lupin III series continued to this day, but it also helped launch the career of a couple of the anime industry's most beloved and respected directors.
All very impressive. But is Lupin III Part 1 worth watching?
I definitely don't think it's bad, but it is old, so the animation isn't going to be amazing. Other than that, a lot of anime, especially older anime, Lupin III Part 1 is very episodic. There's not really any overarching narrative connecting the episodes like you see in later Lupin III anime, such as parts 4 and 5. Of course, outside Zenigata, trying to catch Lupin in nearly every episode. Part 1 also lacks any origin story for most of the characters. There is a bit of one for Goemon, starting in episode 5, titled The Coming of Goemon the 13th, where Lupin first meets Goemon. Then episode 9, Killer Sings the Blues, does provide a little backstory on Fujiko's character, but by and large, there's little to no story on why the characters are working together. One of the opening animations has Lupin describing each of the main characters, and honestly, you don't need much more than that. I think it's what's made Lupin III so easy to pick up for myself, and I'm sure others. There's not really a huge backstory for the characters before they started working together, so most of the time you can pick up any Lupin III entry and be okay not watching anything else that came before it. Despite how many episodes, movies, and TV specials Lupin III has, I think it has a very low barrier to entry for newcomers. Focusing on some episodes that I think are fun and worth the watch, episode 16, titled Operation Jewel Snatch, featured I think a very classic Fujiko, toying and egging Lupin on to steal a shipment of diamonds. Then in the next episode, episode 17, titled Lupin Caught in a Trap, Lupin, Jigen, and Fujiko all have time bombs placed on them by an old friend of Fujiko's and have 24 hours to get 3 billion yen before the bombs go off. It was a thrilling episode and has a nice little twist at the end. It was a very solid episode, and if I was going to show somebody one episode from part 1 to give them a taste of Lupin III, episode 17 would be the episode I show them. And finally, I do want to mention episode 23, The Great Gold Showdown. Not only does it have a decent Lupin heist, but for what ended up being the season finale, I felt it served as a proper farewell for the characters. It didn't feel rushed or anything, and was a very good way to finish the season. The characters coming together one last time until we, the audience, can see them again. All that being said, and while I mostly enjoyed Lupin III Part 1, boy did it take a while to get used to some of the music.
What's wrong with the music?
Admittedly, when I first sat down to watch Part 1, the opening started, and I was expecting the classic Lupin III theme. However, I had forgotten that the classical Lupin III theme we're all familiar with wasn't introduced until Part 2. So instead, the theme for Part 1 is this. Lupin III. While I don't think it's as good, it did grow on me and wasn't the worst song from Part 1.
Was the ending song worse?
No, actually the ending song was pretty decent. The song I don't have much love for is an insert song that appears in a handful of episodes. The song, called Nice Sky Lupin, isn't exactly a banger or anything, and the lyrics are just not very good.
Yeah, he's the Lupin III. Nice man. Yeah, he smiles. Then he gets angry. Sometimes.
To read you back some of the lyrics, yeah, he is Lupin III, nice man, yeah, he smiles, but he gets angry, sometimes, but he's a groovy guy. Honestly, it's a song describing Lupin in the most generic way possible. Overall, I found Lupin III Part 1 to be decent. There were a handful of pretty worthwhile Lupin III episodes that are worth checking out. But with it only having 23 episodes, I think it's worth the time for any modern Lupin III fan, like myself, to check out Part 1. At the very least, to see and experience the roots of the series. And if you're a fan of Studio Ghibli or Miyazaki, you may be interested in checking out some of Miyazaki and Takahata's earlier works. And Lupin III Part 1 is as good a place as any to start, as their contributions back then would shape and guide the tone for most of the Lupin III series to date.
Crazy to think how influential they've been, even back then.
Isn't it? While it's not necessary to watch Lupin III Part 1 to enjoy and understand later Lupin III entries, going back and seeing how the series was in its early days, for me, has been fun and informative, and helped me appreciate some of the new stuff a little more than I already did. If you're interested in checking Lupin III Part 1 out, it's available, at the time of recording, on Crunchyroll, Amazon Prime, and even Tubi TV, a completely free streaming service, albeit with commercials. And with all that said, what are your thoughts on Lupin III Part 1? And do you have a favorite episode from it? Let us know in the comments below. As always, I've been Anime VISOR.
And I've been SiGNUM.
Thanks for watching, and see you later.
Bye bye.